And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Ferran, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some, more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body along the way. This is our 40th episode in the Journey Through the Scripture series. We hope that you look at the past ones, in particular, episode 39, where we actually did part one of what we're wrapping up today with part two, the end of David's reign and judgment and promise. This will be our final episode in our treatment of David. And then moving forward, we're actually going to take a brief pause to do a exile excursus as a teaser, where we'll really tie together some themes tied to the destruction and dissolution that is kind of emanating from the fall of David's great kingdom too. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Yeah, one of the things too that I think hopefully our listeners are wrestling with too is not only implications for all these things too, but really starting to understand that David serves many roles and functions within redemptive history. And so what were the three judgment options Yahweh provided to David in response to his sin? And then how did the Lord's response affirm David's continued role, as I just alluded to, shepherd mediator on behalf of his people, even in the midst of his failure? So holding on to that role, even in the midst of the failure that had just happened with Bathsheba and the census.
Well, again, David as king is the shepherd of Israel. He is the shepherd on God's behalf. And in this instance, David shepherding God's people meant that he would intervene for them in their guilt by taking this census and extracting from each individual this half shekel atoning payment ransom for the sake of dealing with their collective and individual guilt before God. And his failure to take that half shekel to exact that ransom left the people still in a place of guilt with God's anger directed against them. And so the result is that God now is going to pour out his judgment against the people. But even here we see this kind of mediatorial role of David in that God lets David pick what the punishment of the people is going to be. And the text says either 3 years, in the case of Samuel, 7 years. I think the 7 is a wrong, and that's a matter of manuscripts and everything. But I think the actual case, and this is the way First Chronicles puts it, 3 years of famine in the land, 3 months of David and essentially, the people under his authority fleeing from their enemies, being assaulted by their enemies, or 3 days of pestilence. The Lord would come against them in a plague. And David is asked to choose, which will you have? Well, that's again a mediatorial thing. But what David does is he casts himself on God's mercy. He recognizes he's the one who's wrong in this. He's not the one to choose what the punishment should be. He's the one that's at fault. So he casts himself on God's mercy. And the result is that God brings a 3-day plague throughout the land of Israel.
What did David's response to the devastating plague among his countrymen reveal about his sense of priestly responsibility as Israel's king? And once again, King, like we keep beating that drum around, we can't forget, yes, it is King David too is, but this priestly aspect of his administration is critical, not only to what's happening in that near-term circumstance, but as we've talked about, like the cosmic implications and how these things ultimately point towards his son, right? His true son.
Right. Well, again, God brings a plague on the land, and from Dan to Beersheba, which means from north to south, and 70,000 men die through this process of God's plague. And the angel of the Lord is the one who's administering this killing plague throughout the land. And when he is poised, when David sees him poised in front of Jerusalem, he's now, he's gone throughout the land, 70,000 have died. Now he's come to Jerusalem itself. And at that point, David cries out to God and said, I'm the one who has sinned. I'm the one who has not been faithful in this. These are your sheep. Why are they suffering? And he pleads with God to stay his hand. And God tells the angel, stop, it's enough. So when Jerusalem is about to be destroyed, it's at that point that David intervenes and God causes his angel to stay his hand. That itself, again, is mediatorial. David is standing in the gap for the sake of the people, very much as Moses did centuries earlier. But God then directs David to bring an offering, to present an offering. Essentially, the angel is standing at a threshing floor owned by a man. One version says Orana, another says Ornan, same individual. So David goes, and this is where he's to build an altar and present these offerings on behalf of the people. And he purchases this site from the man Ornan or Arana, and in order to build an altar there. And this man wants to give it to David. You're the king, his devotion, his loyalty to David. Let me give you this. And David said, no, I will not offer to the Lord what costs me nothing. I'm going to pay the full price for this. And he ultimately buys that whole site, not just the immediate threshing floor, but the whole site. And the text will tell us that that site is on Mount Moriah, which traditionally was where Abraham had sacrificed Isaac. But that becomes the site now where the temple will be built. So David intervenes in this way. He offers this offering on behalf of the people. In a way, he kind of makes right what was wrong. He was supposed to do this census to make atonement for the people. Now he's standing in the gap and, as it were, making atonement through this sacrifice that God has directed him to make. But at the site where the temple will ultimately be built. So once again, we see David in a priestly role, offering sacrifices at that place in Jerusalem.
How did David's faithful priestly intercession remarkably set the stage for the Jerusalem temple that he had always longed to build for Yahweh?
Well, and I guess I've kind of spoken to that, but this becomes the site where the temple will be built. And I don't know that David knew that at that time. I mean, certainly he didn't decide on that place. That's the place that God directed him to build an altar and present this offering. So in kind of a remarkable way, this longing that David had had for years, that even expressed to Nathan, why should I be living in a palace, in a settled house in Jerusalem, while Yahweh's dwelling in a tent? I want to build a permanent dwelling for him. Even as I've brought the ark, the kind of the focal point of God's enthronement, I've brought that up to Jerusalem, in a sense, enthroning Yahweh on Mount Zion, but the throne of Yahweh is in a tent. I want to establish him here, even as he had made known through Moses to the people of Israel that he would assign a place where his name was to dwell forever. And as we've discussed, David believed Jerusalem was that site. So he had that longing for many years, and that was behind his intent to build a temple in Jerusalem. And God had, through that longing, made his covenant with David that it won't be you, it will be a son to come from you. And in fact, I'll establish your house and throne and kingdom. You want to build me a house, I'm going to build you a house. Well, that's the Davidic covenant. But now, years later, in a kind of a remarkable way, what David had longed to see happen, now, in a sense, the final piece of that preparation is in place. David's been gathering materials through tribute, through the nations for many years, and he knows through the covenant that a son to come from him is going to build that house. As we'll see, he comes to believe Solomon is that one. But now God, through this kind of amazing circumstance, has provided the site, the specific place in Jerusalem where that temple is to be built. And traditionally, it's the site where Abraham had offered Isaac.
God had instituted the census law as an atoning mechanism and also to provide for the ministration of the tabernacle/sanctuary. Why is it crucial to understand this particular census episode in terms of that law and its intent, Kit?
Well, again, if we view this census the way it's commonly viewed, which is David was just guilty of wanting to count his fighting men to basically take stock of his fighting force and his military strength. He wasn't trusting the Lord, he was trusting his military might, and that was a sin. It was unbelief on his part. Well, that understanding doesn't in any way connect us with this idea of the Davidic covenant and the promise to David, and even it doesn't give us any sense to any way to really understand the significance of David's offering on this threshing floor and how this becomes the site of the temple. If we situate this census in that Mosaic law, the point of that census was, as we talked before, twofold. First, it was to deal with the people's guilt before God. It was an atoning mechanism. It dealt with the people's collective guilt before God, but on an individual basis. Rich,
Right.
poor, noble, ignoble, each person was to be counted and assessed a half shekel ransom payment. Well, and how would that be used? To support the priestly mediation, to support the sanctuary
Right.
and this relationship between God and Israel. So if we understand David's census in that light, then it makes perfect sense. It ties that census as kind of the capstone episode in David's life as the scriptures present it. That kind of capstone episode becomes a capstone related to the Davidic covenant and the house of God and the building of Yahweh's dwelling and God building David's house, as well as also this principle of Davidic mediation and how the people's relationship will be maintained with respect to God in relation to his own dwelling in their midst. So there's a lot of different threads weaving in and out of this, but we don't catch those threads, and we ultimately miss the meaning of this census episode and even how it culminated with David securing this threshing floor where the temple was to be built, and how that brings the whole longing of David and the Davidic covenant and David's life full circle. Ultimately, the significance of David is that he would be the one through whom Yahweh would see his house built, and that would come in connection with the building of a house for David. And all of these themes come to the forefront with the birth of Jesus and even the way that he's introduced. This one will sit on the throne of his father David, and the Lord will establish his house and the throne of his kingdom forever. Well, that's Davidic language. That's Davidic covenant language. That's sanctuary language. That's temple language. So I think it's crucially important to view this census through the lens of that Mosaic census law, and not just simply as, oh, David counted his military might and that was wrong. We won't catch these other threads of meaning and significance if we take that view.
Kit, help us reconcile the ideas of failure and purpose. I think from a natural perspective, when we hear the word failure, we certainly don't equate that with, well, like, how can purpose also live within that or be nested within that? But we see that throughout scripture, and even through what we progressed through so far. We saw that with Noah, right? We've seen that with Moses, right? Like we've seen that with Abraham. Help us reconcile those two ideas from God's perspective, that you can have true failure, utter failure, right? In many respects. But at the end of the day, purpose can also still be present and fully formed as well. Help us kind of make sense of that too, because we continue to talk about David's failure, shortcomings, but at no point have we removed this idea of purpose from his life and where he sits within redemptive history.
Right. Well, I think most basically, if purpose can't work through failure, if God's intent and God's designs can't work through failure, then his purposes can't be realized. Because in a very real way, from the point of the creation forward, God was continually working through human failure working on the stage of not just human history, but in the creation, in time and space, in the context of a creational curse. And certainly we see that come to a climax in Jesus himself, where how did the great triumph or fulfillment of God's purpose come about? Through God working in the context of the greatest failure or exercise of the creational curse against those purposes. And certainly Jesus' generation looked at him and they said, this one isn't blessed of the Lord. How can this one be, who he claims to be when there's all of these difficulty and struggle and calamity that surrounds him, climaxing with the cross. They say, if you're the Son of God, come down off that cross.
Right.
The cross was the greatest expression of a person being subjected to the creational curse and its evil and its opposition to God and his ways and his purposes. And yet it was in the man Jesus fully submitting himself to all of this that contradicts and opposes God's intent for his creation. It was through the apparent triumph of that contradiction and opposition that God's purposes were actually truly and fully realized. Jesus became king through fully yielding himself to the powers that were wielding themselves against him. And there's a profound kind of irony and lack of intuitiveness to all of that. God triumphs through himself in the form of the incarnate Son, yielding himself to that which opposes him. He lets evil and opposition and contradiction and the curse do its worst against him, even to the point of collapsing him under the power of mortality and death in order to destroy death, to overcome death. So failure and curse and evil and opposition to God's purposes from the very beginning has been the way in which God has advanced, developed his purposes, carried them forward and worked them out, ultimately bringing them to their full fruition in the person of Jesus himself.
Like, I love how you said, like, there literally is no other way, Kit, right? Just even conceivably too. As we kind of wrap up our episode, Kit, like, this last question is really more comprehensive, tying all the threads together that we've talked about, not only this week, but even last week. How does the episode of David's census, excuse me, the resulting plague and his intercession highlight both the priestly dimension of his kingship and God's covenant purpose in establishing Jerusalem as a place where his people and ultimately all mankind would encounter him? So not just thinking about that actual context, Kit, but just moving forward and looking at the cosmic, once again, now implications of all these things.
Right. Well, once again, God had told Israel through Moses at Sinai that when they came into the land, he would designate a place where he was going to put his name. And to put his name doesn't mean that they would inscribe a plaque and set it on a wall of a building. A place where he would put his name means that this is where he would dwell, be present with, and administer his rule, his lordship over the world in and through his covenant people. And David came to believe after he conquered Jerusalem that that was to be that place. And that's the reason he brings the ark up to Jerusalem. That's the beginning of this enthronement of Yahweh on Mount Zion. But again, the tabernacle and the ministering priesthood and all the rest of the articles of the tabernacle are still at Gibeon. They're not in Jerusalem. So the whole thing is still kind of disjointed. And David wants to build this permanent house. He comes to believe this is that place where Yahweh's going to put his name forever. So he wants to bring up, all of the tabernacle and have the priestly ministration, have Yahweh fully enthroned on Mount Zion in that way. Well, God doesn't grant him to do that, but through that longing comes this thing called the Davidic covenant. And it points to, in the near term, the fact that a son of David will build the house that David himself wanted to build, and we'll see that's Solomon. But at the same time, David recognized even then that God was talking about the distant future, that ultimately this idea of a house was a kind of play on words or multiple meaning. Yes, it was going to be a physical house in Jerusalem, but in connection with God building David's dynastic house, David's dynasty, David's dominion, his throne and his kingdom. And ultimately, when Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem and offers his prayer, he talks about how this is to be the place where all the people in the world will come and encounter you. And he prays and says, Yahweh, are the God of Israel, when the foreigner comes to you here in this place and seeks you at this house, hear him and be merciful to him and receive him. And so once the temple is built and God is in a sense enthroned on Mount Zion, this is the center of the world. This is the center of the earth. This is the place where heaven and earth come together. And so all people everywhere are to come to Jerusalem to meet with Yahweh there. And even the sons of Israel in the 3 pilgrim feasts, they have to come 3 times a year to Jerusalem: Passover, Pentecost, and then the Feast of Booths in the fall. So this is the place where people encounter the Creator God, the God who's not just the God of Israel, but the God of all mankind, the God of all creation. And this theology of the temple and the place of encounter, David is key in that, and the Davidic covenant is key in that. Well, now again, when Jesus comes into the world, the gospel writers are very clear to make the point that this temple theology, this one place in the world where heaven and earth come together, where God is encountered, where people meet him and worship him and live out their lives in relation to him, that becomes incarnated in the Messiah himself. And for a lot of people, this is controversial, but Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple. He's the fulfillment of the sanctuary language. And John, in particular, among the 4 gospel writers, makes that clear. The Word becomes flesh and tabernacles amongst us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That's temple language. That's Shekinah language. The glory presence of God dwelt in the temple. And that happens both with the first tabernacle under Moses and then under Solomon with the first temple. But when that temple's destroyed and later on Israel comes back, the Judeans come back and rebuild the temple, Yahweh doesn't return, but he keeps promising he will. He will return to his temple. Well, the way in which he does that is through this thing called incarnation. And now the dwelling of God is with men in that way, such that all people everywhere come and encounter God and meet with him in the place where he is present, and that place is the person of Jesus himself. He is the rallying point for all the peoples of the earth. And Isaiah, among others of the prophets, speaks to that very idea. So this takes us all the way back to Eden and God's disclosed intent to, in a sense, have the earth, have the creation be his sanctuary, his dwelling place, where he's present and he administers his lordship over the world through his human creature, the priestly, regal image son that he's created. And that all works itself out moving forward in the Israelite history. Israel is a royal priesthood. They're the ones among whom God dwells. They're the ones through whom his presence is to be, going out into the world. They're to be the light of the nations. Well, they fail. David is epitomizing that. He fails, but ultimately one Israelite will come who will, in a very profound way, be the dwelling place of God in the world, so that now Israel, reconstituted in him as the cornerstone of God's dwelling place, they can be built into this temple and now be the light of the nations, such that people of every tribe and tongue and nation and people can come and become living stones in God's true sanctuary. So these ideas that the New Testament ties to Jesus and fleshes out, they all have their origin in the Old Testament, in the Israelite scriptures, and in Israel's history. So this census episode with David ties together the themes of a kingship that is priestly and a mediation and this desire to build a dwelling place for Yahweh, and that as Yahweh builds the house of his priest king, he will in that way build his own house, his dwelling, so that now his purposes for the whole creation can be fulfilled. It stretches all the way back to Eden and all the way back forward to the coming of the Messiah, and ultimately even to that depiction at the end of Revelation in chapter 21 and 22, where the new Jerusalem comes down and now heaven and earth are fully one. And the angelic interpretation is now the dwelling of God is with men. He's with them. And so, our theology of souls going off to heaven isn't biblical. The biblical theology is God's dwelling coming to earth, God bringing himself and his space to dwell with human beings and to dwell with the creation that human beings are a part of. And that has its essential fulfillment in the person of Jesus himself and the work that he accomplished. He is the true sanctuary, and he's now, by the Spirit, building out the fullness of himself as that sanctuary by gathering in people to become living stones in him, as Peter puts it, so that God's house can grow and grow and grow, now a human house, but ultimately that God will be all in all. So there's a lot in that, but certainly it stretches us through all of scriptural revelation and ultimately helps us to see what is God's purpose ultimately, and how does that find its focal point in the person and the work of Jesus.
I love that, Kit. One thing I'm taking away is we must go back to go forward. We truly must understand our Old Testament and how these things are fit together. We sincerely hope this time you've shared with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Faran, and we'll see you down the road.